ready for the average day. Hey, we're live, everybody. It's Friday
guys.
the 13th. Spooky. Spooky. Yet again, another Friday without the FAR CUI rule. We'll talk about that coming up in a little while. I was hoping that it would be the spookiest of the rules coming out on Friday the 13th, but nevertheless, maybe it'll be a Christmas surprise. But before we get to that, Daniel, how are you?
Doing pretty good. It's been a little crazy around here. So we had Thanksgiving, then we had our whole company meeting for a week or so. I know you've been traveling. I got to see you and shake hands in person and do the live stream in the studio, which was great. But yeah, it's just been a lot of catch up before the holidays, people trying to get dollars off their books to start the CMMC journey. It's funny to say that. So many companies are just now starting this journey. And their timeline is very tight. We talked about it, before we went live here. We've got large enterprises that you would have thought would have made some of these decisions 2 or 3 years ago, even just to adhere to our good friend DFARS 7012, but they're only just starting for tens of thousands of users. It's pretty wild out there.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you were at the holiday party when it was just 12 or 25 people back in the day, and now we've got like 10 times that.
25, 30 people in Scott's neighborhood clubhouse is where I had my first 3 Christmas parties.
In the garage.
Yeah, basically. Yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah, it's great to see the growth. It's great to see everybody getting started. It's the holidays. Everybody's having a good time, and we have some fun updates. A while ago, somebody submitted a question being like, hey, what are some recommended events that we should go to in the ecosystem to keep up? So a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. Air horns in the background. CS2 2025 will be in Reston, Virginia, May 6th and 7th. So if you've never been to a CS2, you're missing out. It is the original, biggest, longest running, highly reviewed event in the CMMC ecosystem. So it's going to be in Reston, May 6th and 7th. You can see the little code scrolling across the banner across the bottom. If you use the code, let's see, make sure I say it right, Hotline Reston, all caps, 15% off the registration. We're going to have more agenda details coming out in the new year. It's always fun trying to get agendas finalized right around the holidays because people are completely mentally checked out through December, and then they're all trying to catch up in early January. I'll be speaking at CS2, which is always fun from what people have said from past CS2s. And I think people will find it interesting. I've been kicking this idea around for a while. Something I'm informally calling, and feel free to let us know in the chat, something I'm informally calling maybe the 800-171 reduction project or the CMMC reduction project. So the way that 853 is designed and written creates a lot of redundancy that is very useful if you're using 853 the way it was intended to be used. But when you derive standards from 853, like 171 and 172, there is a ton of duplication throughout the document, making it way longer than it needs to be. So without rewriting controls, without changing how they're written, the style, any of that, there are ways to go through and very quickly reduce the overall size of these documents by, I'm going to guess, based off my initial analysis, at least 30% of the length of the document, making it much easier to understand, much easier to read, much easier to use as a reference document. And so hopefully we can put that up as the correct formatting, the improved formatting to NIST, maybe to the AB and the DoD for future versions of the CMMC assessment guide. So over the next couple months, I'll be working on that. And then we talk about it at CS2. And if it's popular, then maybe we can run with it from there. But CS2 is always a great event. Use that code, discounted registration, in person, virtual. It's going to be a good time. Alrighty. Okay, let's see here. Thoughts of the week, like normal. Daniel, are you frozen?
Nope, I'm here.
Oh, okay. You were locked in thought, meditating.
I'm locked in.
Meditating on the benefits of CS2. You're going to be speaking, Daniel, as well. You're always one of the most popular speakers at CS2. It's a good time. I can't wait. I love CS2 season.
It's going to be fun. It's a blast.
Well, speaking of good times.
Let's talk about times for our friends over the sea here.
Let's talk about CMMC and international implications. Only one of the largest elephants in the room, of the many elephants in the room, I guess we could say. What are you hearing, Daniel? What are you thinking? What's going on with this fun part?
Everybody's under the impression that there's some level of reciprocity being worked with all of our friendly allies in America, non-American defense contractors and their respective countries. Kind of what we've heard is doesn't seem to really be happening. Even in the CMMC FAQ on the DoD CIO's website, they basically say, hey, there's no need for your country to do their own things. They can just follow the CMMC program as it's written in 32 CFR. So they basically went ahead and said, hey, you don't have to necessarily do your own thing, just follow 32 CFR and get the check, right? There's a couple of problems with that. One problem is a lot of these countries don't want to allow a U.S. CMMC assessor, a C3PAO, to come and assess their maybe British or UK defense contractor, right? The Ministry of Defense has actually been pretty staunch and to make sure that doesn't happen. Well, as far as I know, Jacob, there's not really any other C3PAOs outside of the United States that have been certified yet. I don't think there's a kind of a global C3PAO or in any other countries. That should be coming, hopefully. So that will kind of fix the personship requirement that some of these countries are imposing. But the other side of it is exemptions. So I'll give you an example, right? If you're in the EU and you're using the Microsoft cloud, Microsoft in commercial used to meet FedRAMP requirements. Now it doesn't, right? Even with multi-geo turned on. Microsoft commercial has never met paragraph C through G of incident response. Both things that you're going to be judged against come time of your CMMC assessment. And so Jacob and I were throwing around this yesterday. This is from the DoD Procurement Toolbox for those that have not seen this particular link. It's got a great list of FAQs. It's kind of the OG to the CMMC FAQ on the DoD CIO website. And one of the things that this was talking about is, hey, I have foreign subcontractors. What do we need to do here? And it's basically writes out things and basically says, hey, go through and go get an exemption, right? Email the DoD CIO, talk it through and then get approvals for any kind of exemptions you're going to have for maybe it's incident response. Maybe you're trying to get approved for, not being able to use FedRAMP clouds, even though I've never seen that or heard that ever passing. Good luck on that. So basically what's happening, and it happened on a call this week, is a large organization, several thousand people, has been in the Microsoft commercial cloud, went through a DIBCAC High assessment earlier this year and passed their DIBCAC High with a very, very high score, only to find out 4 months later that the Microsoft Commercial Cloud has now decided to revoke their FedRAMP status for their commercial cloud, right? So now they're having to go back and figure out, okay, can we get an exemption? What do we do? Because international organizations, if they do not have a US-based address, like location, Microsoft will not grant you eligibility for the GovCloud. So now my only option is really to go on-prem. So you're telling me to take my whole several thousand organization from Microsoft Commercial with all the collaboration tools back on-prem to on-prem Exchange and use other FedRAMP tools that might be out there. And so there's a lot of conversation around exemptions, how those work, because it is becoming very, very problematic for international companies to be able to, A, find an assessor that is of their nationality to actually come do their assessment, and B, they're having a challenge, going through and getting exemptions that a C3PAO should end up honoring. And that was the big conversation, Jacob. Hey, if the DoD CIO provides you an exclusion that you do not have to meet, maybe it's a control, maybe it's a cloud requirement, maybe it's an incident response requirement, does a C3PAO have to honor that and basically it kind of quote unquote ignore that piece of it for the platforms that are in scope? I think you were saying, they should.
Yeah, to me, that's the way it ought to work, just intuitively, right? The classic example is with the language in DFARS 7008 and 7012, which tell you when you handle the pertinent data, you have to implement the controls. If for some reason you can't meet one of those controls, then you work with the DoD CIO's office to come up with an exception, right? And that variance or exception is documented, and then that is the local rule, if you will, for that assessment. So you're getting an exception to a control or a requirement from the DoD CIO's office, and then you document it accordingly. If anybody shows up to assess you, then you show them the paperwork, and then that requirement, you don't get dinged for that requirement. If you have a exemption to some contractual obligation in DFARS 7012, and then an assessor shows up, they can't ding you for you having an authorized exemption. That wouldn't make any sense to me at all. But this feels a lot like what we've talked about before with CMMC exposing existing issues, right? So talking about international compliance with DFARS 7012 and all of its paragraphs, including the obligation to work in FedRAMP. Now it is more difficult, more tedious to work in FedRAMP in the Microsoft cloud because you can't use commercial. You have to use GCC High, and that creates a snag if you're international and getting into the Gov cloud. So this isn't actually being caused by CMMC as much as it's being exposed by CMMC. Mm-hmm. And that's really the problem, because people then turn and they say, well, what's CMMC's answer to this situation? And the CMMC PMO, the CMMC program office, goes, well, that isn't in our jurisdiction, essentially. That's an office of the Undersecretary for Acquisition and Sustainment, a DCMA, their international coordination office, and how they deal with what that is going to be. And I've heard this now for going on several years, where there have been bilateral negotiations between the US and the UK, US and Australia, US and New Zealand, the US and Israel, the US and Germany, South Korea, on and on and on and on and on, about how they're going to hammer out all of these things. Some countries don't want American assessors, or they have no problem with the American standard. Some countries don't care, and they're like, yeah, it can be American assessors and the American standard. Some countries want their own local homegrown deal, and so they just ended up, the last I heard, was doing these individual bilateral agreements based on country. But that isn't what the CMMC program office is working on. And so we don't get any updates about what's going on, and everybody sort of yells at the AB or the CMMC program office. And so it would be really nice if we got the updates from the folks in the other undersecretary offices about what's going on with the international obligation that would still be the obligation whether CMMC was making progress or not. Like, what do you guys want them to do?
Well, and I was about to say, it's really, CMMC is not stopping because of this. Like, these other defense contractors in other countries are going to have to make some concessions. Either their ministries of defense are going to have to say, we're going to allow U.S. persons to come assess, because there's maybe not of enough foreign assessors, if any at all right now, or coming back to the platform and the exemptions and things like that. I think we're going to see a significant fall off over the next 12 months of foreign defense contractors participating in the supply chain, especially if their primes are forcing them to get CMMC certified, and they basically, due to their own country's regulations, legally cannot invite people to come certify them.
Yeah. I mean, I know that Matt Travis, Cyber AV, CEO, has done a lot of international travel recently based off of what I've heard about some of the folks in ANS, the CIO's office, and other related offices. They have been doing a lot of international travel recently. Not that I'm tracking their tail numbers of their flights or anything like that on a corkboard just off screen that you can't see. But they have been moving around the globe. Yeah. And so I would hope that sometime in Q1, we get some kind of an update about what's going on, because the rollout's going to happen. So we got to come up with an answer somehow. Meanwhile, we're still waiting. The one that we probably heard the most about is Canada, and they're creating like their own CMMC and their own AB and their own system. And I heard that they were supposed to be on the town hall recently, and that they were supposed to be announcing that was coming out. And so that's still kind of hanging. And this is the problem with the holiday doldrums, right? Is that we get close enough into December and the kind of the winter holidays and things like that, and everybody is starting to sort of shut down, not just the Americans on Thanksgiving, right? So I would imagine that, probably in Q1, usually March, April is like, there's hearings, there's updates, there's this, there's that. Same thing that we see right after summertime, right? After summer coming into September, October, there's just a flurry of stuff that comes out, and then it kind of trails off. But yeah, there's a major issue, and they gotta figure it out.
Yep. We got to get through Boxing Day for some answers. So,
yeah. Well, speaking of coming up with answers, the effective date of the 32 CFR final rule is Monday, December 16th.
Monday.
And that is when officially the rule is in effect. It is no longer pending, right? It is actually a regulation on the books at that point. And for those of you with joint surveillance assessments that meet the qualifying criteria to be converted into CMMC level 2 assessments, all that stuff has to be done and wrapped up by the effective date of the rule. I've had a couple people message me recently being like, hey, our POAM package is hanging out with DibCAC. We haven't heard anything. What do we do? And I'm like, keep calling, because I don't know. I don't know the answer. But for those of you, if you don't know, I mean, it's still relatively early on the East Coast. If you haven't heard an update or, whatever, you have a meeting, call somebody, figure out what's going on, because after 12/16, any JSVAs that are still going to occur won't be eligible for conversion. I'm assuming that if your package is already there and it's in the queue, that you should be good to go, but I don't know for certain. But if you are still waiting on an answer, definitely look into this, because you only have, a day.
So here's a question for you, Jacob. I had heard murmurs that because the cap is still not released, CMMC assessment process, procedure, that assessments are not actually able to start. Formal commercial assessments cannot start the 16th. So you'll have this gap of converted JSVAs into CMMC certs, and then a big question mark and a gap until the new cap is released before formal CMMC assessments can actually start commercially. Do you have any updates on that?
Yeah, so there'll be a gap of, maybe a couple weeks, apparently, from what we've heard. And that's just a process of all the AB's to-do list to get finished up. The last that I've heard is that the final version of the cap is going through final signatures and approval, because you're talking about language for the Code of Professional Conduct, the language for the cap. And so based off of talking with some people that we know who are in that review process, it's like going through the last, they're like catching, like, we missed a comma here. We need to like change this, this contraction here, kind of a thing. So I would imagine that's not going to be that far away. So it maybe comes out a week or two after that 12/16, and that's when commercial assessments can start. But yeah, JSVA conversions happen on 12/16. So for some small period of time, you'll have a group of companies that are automatically CMMC certified, and then commercial assessments start a week to 3 weeks later. But yeah, we have to wait for that official final cap to come out. I assume that they're going to do that before the end of the year based off of the progress that we've heard about it. For all intents and purposes, I don't think a lot of people were trying to get their assessments started the day before Christmas. So everything should be in place for January, which is not too bad, considering that the AB had 60 days to get, all the final information off the final rule. One day, when the rule is in the rearview mirror and this whole system's just sort of humming along, people won't remember, like, oh, well, you had to have this, and that started this, and then that triggered this, and then we had to sequence all these other things. So it'll smooth out in the long run, especially by the time most people are ready for their assessments. But your JSVA deadline, 12/16. So for those of you who already qualified, you're good to go. Congratulations. Spike the football, send up the fireworks. For those of you that have JSVAs, I don't know of anybody. If you have a JSVA scheduled after 12/16, then definitely revisit that before you leave, before you check out on Friday.
And little plug for the podcast this week. We had Fernando on, incredible C3PO and friend of Summit 7. He's booked out until August of next year. So if you didn't go through joint surveillance and you want to get certified in some reasonable amount of time, pick up the phone and make calls. Get your what he calls the reservation in place, because August of next year. That's wild.
Yeah, tons of people are in line, and I've been getting lit up on LinkedIn about this. We've said it once, we've said it a million times. I will continue to say it. Right, the primary constraint on your success to achieving CMMC is not the lack of assessors. The primary constraint is the ability to implement everything to become ready for an assessment. I am not saying that the lack of assessors is not an issue, or that you shouldn't work with a C3PO to get your spot in line or whatever, right? What I'm saying is that when people hear that there aren't enough assessors. They then rationalize inaction by saying, well, it's a useless thing to try and pursue anyways because there aren't enough assessors. And that is the wrong decision to make. So for those of you on LinkedIn who think that I'm saying, don't worry about the lack of assessors, that is not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is don't convince yourself that you can get away with not doing anything because of the lack of assessors when your first primary obligation is getting ready for the assessment. If everyone were ready for assessment, which we know is not true, and there were still not enough assessors, then the primary constraint is assessment capacity. But that is not the situation that is playing out. So I appreciate everybody listening. I appreciate the passionate responses. I appreciate the fun and dynamic conversations that go on in the comments and the messages on LinkedIn. But there's a bit of subtlety here with how we're structuring these things. Alrighty, let's see here. Oh, well, speaking of our episode with Fernando, everybody should check it out. We're going to have him back on in the future. Crazy enough, he and I both spoke at CS2 San Diego. You and I and Fernando all spoke at CS2 San Diego back in 2021. 2021, wow. Back in the day. So yeah, Fernando's been an OG. He's been around for a long time. He definitely knows his stuff. One of the questions that I asked Fernando on the podcast was, do your assessments cost $100,000? And the answer was no, not even close. We have had a bunch of companies get scheduled for their CMMC assessments, work very closely with C3PAOs. We know a lot of the C3PAOs. They know us. They know how we operate, all of our technical solutions, things like that. In your experience, Daniel, what's the rough ballpark for an assessment cost?
Small business, one site is probably on the low end about 20,000, and I've seen things upwards of about 40,000. And that's kind of 50 users and below, single site, kind of small boundary, somewhere between that 20 and 40K. Although I have heard of prices, the last kind of thing I heard for a 75 person company with one site was a $60,000 assessment. Now, I don't know the complexity of their boundary, but one site with 75 people, I just can't imagine there's that much complexity there. I think that's more of a demand of the market causing some of those prices to go up more than anything.
Yeah. If you need it sooner rather than later, it's going to be more expensive rather than cheaper for sure. But I have yet to hear of a C3PAO that came out and be like, yeah, starting price is generally in the ballpark of $100,000.
No,
the rule does not estimate. The rule does not estimate that that's the cost. I've never heard of that being the going cost. I would imagine that if you really want to, and you're running that kind of business, big, complex, this, that, and you want to take a lot of time and you're not all that prepared, you could probably spend that kind of money if you're looking to spend that kind of money.
Yeah.
But for the average company in the DIB, especially the kinds of companies that are in our portfolio, we have not seen assessment costs approach even anywhere close to the $100,000 estimate that gets bandied about from time to time, as you've probably seen and heard
on the Reddits all the time.
Every time it's $100,000. So that's not what we heard. Check out the episode with Fernando. It's very informative. It's only like 20-25 minutes, so you can go from there. Alrighty. Any speculation about the date when contractors will start seeing CMMC requirements in contracts? Based off of what we have heard the government say, and based off of what we have analyzed on our own, based off of previous rulemaking, we expect that you will start to see CMMC requirements show up in DoD contract solicitations sometime between March and June of 2025. The government, in various blogs, statements, things like that, since the rule, have said closer to March. Based off our analysis of what we've seen with average rulemaking timelines, we think it's going to be somewhere closer to like the beginning of summer, late spring, rather than Q1. But I think that your 90% confidence interval for where the cone of probability lands is sometime between March and June of 2025 for when it shows up in contracts.
And this would be new contracts or maybe contracts coming up for option years, not retroactive for those that are unaware of that. So, just be aware that when they start coming down, your BD team is going to be the tip of the spear to identify this DFARS 7021 clause. And they need to wave the flag and say, hey, we got this CMMC thing in our solicitation. What do we do? Can we do this?
Yeah.
So.
Well, it's actually interesting that you bring that up about, they won't retroactively change all contracts. That's very expensive. Very rarely does a contract update or clause or anything like that retroactively change existing contract language. But that brings up an interesting question that came in that's somewhat related. Somebody said, once the CMMC rule is official, meaning I assume effective, we will have 60 to 90 days to get CMMC implemented. So a couple things here. When the 32 CFR CMMC rule goes into effect on December 16th, that does not trigger some sort of 60 or 90-day clock for every company in the DIB to have a CMMC certification. Although I'm sure the DoD would love that. If that were possible to press a magical button, that would be wonderful. Once the other CMMC rule, the 48 CFR CMMC rule, that updates the contract clause language that actually puts CMMC status level requirements in contracts. Once that goes into effect and the phase rollout begins and we start to see those requirements in contracts, even that does not necessarily trigger a 60 to 90-day clock for all contractors to achieve CMMC. Now, we've talked about this before. Contractors should have already implemented the cybersecurity requirements pursuant to DFARS 7012 in their contract language. But your clock for when to achieve CMMC is based off of when you believe that the solicitations that you will bid on will have the requirement and when you need to take award of those contracts. That might be a 60-day window. It might be a 30-day window. It might be a 3-month to 9-month window. It just depends on the solicitation, the award, the agency, the program office, your particular customer, how your prime decides to do business. Your clock depends on your specific situation, what kind of work you plan on doing. There isn't some sort of overarching deadline like there was with DFARS 7012 back in the day, where they said all contractors must be compliant by December 31st of 2017. So that's why it's important to pay attention to your procurement administrative lead times for how long the DoD takes to go from advertising a solicitation to awarding a contract, because your CMMC certification is a condition of contract award.
Now, I will say this. That doesn't mean your prime's not going to give you a deadline. And the tricky part is nobody knows what solicitations or contracts this is going to hit in what order. So you're playing a little bit of a Russian roulette when it comes to delaying, because you don't know what opportunities you will not be able to pursue until it's too late, because it's impossible to get implemented and certified in a 30, 40, 60-day period. I mean, assessments are already, booked out till August for some of the C3PAOs.
Yeah, absolutely. Alrighty, let's get to some live comments here. John says, we want to have Azure AD change minimum password length from 8 to 10 characters, but it's hard set. If we sync our on-prem AD to Azure, does that put my on-prem in scope?
As a security protection asset. Yep. So I'm assuming you're using your local AD to be your primary identity management. You're using Intra ID Connect to sync those to Intra ID, or the artist formerly known as Azure AD. So yeah, your AD would be in scope as a security protection asset, which you have to apply. I forget the verb. Was it applicable or relevant? What was the verbiage for SPAs? What was that updated to? Do you remember? Basically, the requirements for that security protection asset, not all 110 requirements on that. So yeah, your AD would be in scope as an SPA.
Gotcha. All righty, let's see here. So Scott says, what about DFARS 7010? That is where data sovereignty sits as a requirement. So DFARS 7010, very quickly, DFARS 7010 is for information systems operated on behalf of the Department of Defense. Most contractors are not operating information systems on behalf of the Department of Defense, including international contractors. So for 99% of the people listening to this Q&A stream, 99% of the people in the DIB, DFARS 7010 is not something that is applicable to you, nor is it something that you need to necessarily worry about. Now, it was updated via rulemaking in 2016, along with DFARS 7012 and things like that. But DFARS 7010 is not a consideration or a concern for most people in the DIB.
Now, there is a DFARS 7048 clause. I just pulled it up here on my screen, Jacob. That would be applicable if you're seeing that for export control items and those back into data sovereignty requirements for contractors of items of this type.
Gotcha. All righty. Let's see here. John, I don't know if this is going to show up or if it got cut off. So, John, if you want to resubmit or maybe rephrase if we miss any part of this. John says, we have a federal enclave for CUI and also use a co-location that houses FCI data. If both are in scope, does the colo require CMMC level 2 compliance or CMMC certification since we have to be CMMC?
Okay, I think I'm tracking this one. So you have a colo data center that has just FCI, and that's for CMMC level 1. Then you have a federal enclave for CUI that's going to be at a level 2 certification level, right? Your colo in your data center does not have to have applicable level 2 controls. It just has to have level 1. But the minute that you're processing, storing, or transmitting CUI from that federal enclave in your colo, that's where that scope would come in that would overlay those 110 on your colo environment. So as long as you're keeping the data silo, FCI and colo, CUI and federal enclave, and neither the two shall meet, then you are okay. So the 17 practices for the colo, the 110 practices for the federal enclave.
Gotcha. Alrighty.
And if that wasn't right and you had more context, feel free to drop another comment.
Yeah, let us know, John, if that was the right version of that one. I just want to make sure. Sometimes with the character limit, it cuts it off, but you might have just missed the period on the end of there. Alrighty, Michael Wolf is back. Our weekly listener, Hall of Fame listener, Michael Wolf. We love seeing you every week, man. He says, with data generated on behalf of a contract, is it correct that it is not CUI unless specifically stated in the contract language? However, it would most likely be CTI, right? So, Daniel, I don't know if you're pulling up your handy dandy slide deck. I'll tell you that as far as rules of thumb go for things being CUI or not, the best and most reliable rule of thumb is whether the data is proprietary. And that's the one that you're going to hear Ryan Bonner talk about all the time in the various talks that he's given at CS2, which you can find on our YouTube page, the various podcast episodes he's been on. Proprietary data is not CUI. However, if you are generating data pursuant to CTI definitions under a DoD contract, then I would hesitate to tell somebody that the rule of thumb is that it is not CUI.
So we talked about procedurals the other day, and basically, hey, what's a good list of things that are CUI? And we'll talk about that here in just a second. But this is the general definition of CUI, the federal rule of actually designating what it is. It's information the government creates or possesses, or that an entity, aka like a contractor, creates or possesses for or on behalf of the government. Again, if it's proprietary data, you've already created that, not in service to the government, right? You've already created and generated that. And a law, regulation, or government-wide policy has to have some sort of standard or supporting document to say this actually is CUI. Now, how do you know what's CUI on a specific contract? Your contracting officer should know. Or there's this thing called Contract Data Requirements List, CDRL, which I have the link. Let me stop and pivot to that. The link that you sent in chat actually earlier between Joy and I here, Jacob.
Yeah. This is an awesome website. If people don't know about this, actnotes.com should be bookmarked for everyone who's a contractor, everyone who's working in this ecosystem. Actnotes.com is awesome. So the guy who created ActNotes is local out here in Southern California because there's a ton of space systems engineering, bunch of DoD acquisitions, major campuses for Northrop, Raytheon, Boeing. Like there's a ton of aerospace primes. You know, there's actually a lot of people don't know LA Air Force Base is right next to LAX. It's about this big. There's no runway. It's 3 buildings, and it's just Air Force, Space Force, satellite space system acquisitions run out of that command. And so there's the major prime campuses and then the countless subcontractors throughout the greater Southern California region that only work on space, satellite, and then you go a little further south, a lot of Navy systems. This guy created ActNotes as a reference for people who work in those acquisition communities, and it has definitions, examples, links to anything that you can imagine that's relevant to the acquisition process, including things like procedurals, including things like milestone decision authorities. If you hear any of this stuff in the rule, DoD referring to it and you want to peer into how that world works, read ACNotes as the perfect acquisition wiki. It is an awesome resource.
And this specifically calls out, these are used to identify potential data requirements in a solicitation, deliverable data requirements in a contract. DFARS subpart 215.470 requires the use of procedurals in the solicitations when the contract will require the delivery of actual data. So this should be a known document to your prime or to the
It is
DoD
absolutely
directly.
known to the primes, between the prime and the government, 100%.
So you need to get request a copy of that so that you can help know what's in scope that could be or will and most definitely be controlled and classified information.
Yeah, and if anybody wants to check out Amir Armand on LinkedIn, friend of the show, friend of Summit 7, friend of CS2, she just did an awesome video going into procedurals. I will say your mileage may vary on your ability to actually get a hold of pertinent procedurals, depending on how your customer's feeling and what they had for lunch that day. But it is another thing that you can potentially leverage and ask for to help you on your way on this wild and wacky journey that we're all on here together. All righty, let's see here. Scott said the DivCAC wanted all POAM closeouts by the 15th ahead of the effective date of the CMC rule. Yeah, I don't know what DivCAC's position is on POAM packages submitted before the 15th, but they haven't gotten back to anybody yet on. So that was the big question. I assume that they will do right by the people who had their paperwork, their ballots mailed in by the midnight deadline. But we'll have to wait and hear. I know that there's been a lot of people feeling a little nervous about the fact they haven't heard any updates about their packages that were done and submitted ahead of time, but they haven't gotten word back on them yet. Okay, let's see. Fun, organic conversations occurring in the chat here. I am around. Has anyone heard anything about the release availability date of the DoD Delta training exam? And Scott, always helpful. Mr. Singer, Delta training will be next week. So definitely check that out. I think the last AV Town Hall on the Keiko segment was talking about Delta training. And then next week, Julie and Jason will be talking about the Town Hall, talking about training, probably giving an update on all these freshly minted lead assessors in the ecosystem. If you've gone on LinkedIn anytime in the last 72 hours, you may have been bombarded by all the people who are announcing their big achievement of becoming lead assessors, which is a big deal. We need a lot of lead assessors, so it's good to see. All righty. Okay. Sorry, I don't know how to pronounce this username. You two do a great service to us all. Thanks. We try. We try. As we are discussing costs, has there been any discussions regarding how we go about reassessing fees and certified costs to the government for these increased costs?
Here's a funny one. The DoD knows that their supply chain has not been doing DFARS 712. And they know that. However, they don't seem to be hyper aware that prices are going to go up as a result of this now being forced to do it, right? Having to have that certification. So long story short, I mean, unless you're a prime, there's really no chargeback models even available to you back to the DoD. So if you're a subcontractor, that just means that your rates to your prime are going to have to go up. Like there's no way around that. There's not some secret chargeback model that you can offset these costs. There is some funding vehicles that they're trying to get through Congress to help at least give maybe some tax breaks or tax credits for doing cybersecurity regulation work. That's in its infancy. Bob Metzger is kind of leading the charge on that and trying to spearhead that element. But yeah, so right now, the money is the money, and the DoD is going to realize in the next 36 months how expensive this CMMC thing has actually been. And also, on the other hand, it'll show how many defense contractors haven't been meeting 7012 the whole time. So it'll be an interesting, they're going to have to pay more for things, but there's also going to be a heck of a lot of suppliers are going to see leave the ecosystem because they've been non-compliant up until this point.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a bubble because the cost of implementing and maintaining your compliance with your contractual cybersecurity obligations are supposed to be reflected in your overhead rates. And so if you are not accurately reflecting the cost of cybersecurity in your overhead rates, then you're upside down essentially on your rates. And the DoD, as far as they're concerned, got the bids saying this is our cost for meeting all of these requirements, including cybersecurity, and those are artificially low because it costs money to implement and maintain these requirements, and then it costs money to make sure that somebody come in and verify that you have done them. So yeah, the big flaw here, or sort of not flaw, but the big twist here is the DoD knows that companies haven't been implementing them, which is why CMMC is a program to begin with, but they also know that the rates are not accurate and that your rates are supposed to reflect it. So it's going to be a trade-off. It's going to be a trade-off. The cost of contractor rates right now are artificially low because they do not include the cost of meeting cyber obligations in DFARS 7012. Yet another thing that gets blamed on CMMC. Everybody says the cost of meeting CMMC, the cost of complying with CMMC. The cost of complying with CMMC is the cost of your assessment. The cost of everything else is pursuant to other contract clauses that have existed for a very long time. They get conflated because a lot of people didn't know that they had those obligations until CMMC became a thing. And that's, one of the constants that we see around the ecosystem is that CMMC is going to raise costs. CMMC is going to raise costs in the sense that CMMC is the thing that forces people to comply with their existing obligations that are not imposed by CMMC. So, it feels like splitting hairs.
CFR, the only implementation cost they call out is that for CMMC level 3, which is like less than 1% of the supply chain.
Yeah. Alrighty. Michael says there was some discussion within a LinkedIn post that stated there are discussions going on in Congress with respect to tax legislation, like you mentioned, Daniel, that would assist very small businesses by extending a tax credit to cover some of the unique costs of compliance with the CMMC rule. For example, the cost of assessment and closing POAMs and gaps that surface during assessments. Any speculation on knowledge of this? Yeah, we've heard about this. This is something that's being championed by Bob Metzger, a well-known name in the ecosystem who's been, in this space for quite a long time. I think that's probably the right move in the sense that if the only way essentially to ensure that requirements are being met is by regulating and mandating that companies prove that they have implemented them, and companies are struggling with the cost of implementing things regardless, the answer is not to remove the requirement to prove that you have implemented everything. The answer is that you then somehow have to come up with a solution, either incentives, subsidies, or something else to make sure that people can meet the requirement. If we don't subsidize the ability to pay for security for those companies that need it, and we don't require external verification of the requirements, then we just end up with the same status quo that we've had for a long time that doesn't benefit anybody for anything.
Yeah, and this is, Megan already posted in chat. This was kind of the conversation around this tax credit, and you probably can't see what's highlighted here. It was companies with 50 or fewer employees is what the bill is looking at. So you are right. Smaller business. We don't have a timeline, even understanding kind of where it is in the legislative process. But yeah, hopefully soon. The problem for most people is it probably won't be soon enough. So it's kind of a catch-22. Some of this legwork on, funding, credits, grants, et cetera, should have been done and started a year and a half, 2 years ago in preparation for this. Now it's just a reactive measure that probably won't happen in time for most people. So
yeah, absolutely. All righty. So Nathaniel says, I apologize if this is a redundant question. This is my first time joining. Welcome, Nathaniel. Thanks for hanging out for the first time. Are these live streams recorded or posted on YouTube? Yes, they are. You can find them on our YouTube channel. Make sure you like and subscribe. You can find them under the live tab if you want the recordings. You can also find these on my LinkedIn page. Occasionally, they'll be on the Summit 7 LinkedIn page, but the easiest place to find them is going to be on the YouTube page under live, and you can find the recordings for every week. They're all about an hour. Thanks for the hard work and explanations. Thanks for listening. We would still show up if there was nobody here and we'd just talk to whoever, but it's always great. I think we're average somewhere north of almost 90 people a week tune in to hang out. So it's always fun to hang out with everybody, especially this late in December. So thanks for spending your Fridays with us. Alrighty, let's see.
We got a lot of Go Army, Go Navy situation in the.
Yeah, I got to fix this real
here.
quick. Apparently somebody has put some anti-Navy propaganda in the scrolling banner here ahead of the Army-Navy game. So let me just go ahead and adjust.
To represent Scott Edwards, I have to throw a Go Army out there. Now I know you think differently, Jacob, but you know.
let's go ahead. Okay, all right, yeah. So we got that fixed. So yeah, people are very passionate in the chat about what's going on with the Army Navy game. Megan was sure to remind Nathaniel you should check out the podcast Thursdays at 11 a.m. Eastern. That's right. Thanks, Megan. We do a weekly podcast every Thursday. Once a month, we have a podcast with Joy and Jason that covers everything from the AB Town Hall, covering the CAICO side of things, assessor training, assessor updates, everything that's going on with assessor certifications. It's become its own domain. So we actually need a separate show just on that. And then we do the live Q&A every Friday as well. So, we're quickly approaching, you probably, maybe by this time next year, you can tune in and there'll be something new every day on the channel, depending on what's going on with the way things are growing. Alrighty, let's see. We've got some more stuff that was queued up beforehand. Yes. Can you please provide an update on FAR CUI rule finalization? At this point, I'm ready to break a glass in case of emergency, right? It has been over 45 days since the FAR CUI rule left OIRA regulatory review. I don't know what the averages are for FAR rules to be processed from OIRA review to publication. For DoD rules, it's generally 2 weeks or less, depending on the time of year and whether there's an administration change. So this has been out of OIRA review for quite some time. And I have been, and this is, I'm willing to take this one for the team. I have been strategically scheduling tea times during the week in the afternoons, assuming that would trigger the FAR Council and the Office of the Federal Register to publish the rule to rein on my plans. The surest way to make sure that things would get published was to make plans in the past. And so I've been, for everyone's sake, scheduling afternoon tea times to try to get them to publish the rule, and that has not worked. So in the event that we don't see the FAR CUI rule on Monday or Tuesday, world first announcement, I am willing, for the ecosystem's sake, to take PTO starting on December 18th, all the way through the 2nd of January. And I'm willing to make this sacrifice in the hopes that we can get the FAR CUI rule to finally be published after many, many years. Please hold your applause. So, it's my gift to you that I will take this time off and disconnect from social media and our various shows in order to get the rule published. You're welcome, everyone. You're welcome. And I gladly take on, yes, thank you. I gladly take on this responsibility. Sometimes you just got to take one for the team, and I'm willing to do that. So there we go. That's the current update.
What?
All righty. Do you know if the interim rule, DFARS 204-73, DFARS 7012, DFARS 7020, is supposed to remain intact throughout the CMMC phase-in period? Yes. So CMMC becoming a thing, the DFARS 7021 clause, the corresponding to be determined number for the CMMC provision that makes you aware of the CMMC clause, do not replace DFARS 7012, DFARS 7020, DFARS 7008, or DFARS 7019. So DFARS 7008 is the provision that makes you aware of the obligations in your contract clause. DFARS 7012, CMMC is a program that verifies that you have implemented those requirements. So those are not going to be replaced by CMMC. DFARS 7019 is the provision that makes you aware of your obligations pursuant to the clause DFARS 7020, namely DoD's right and ability to show up on your doorstep and investigate what's going on, to take a closer look at things. And they even say in the CMMC final rule for 32 CFR that they reserve the right to show up at any time to conduct those investigations pursuant to DFARS 7020. So they are not in conflict, although the wording could be clearer for sure. They're written at different times by different offices. They serve separate complementary functions, and so they will not be replaced by each other. They will remain intact
So DFARS 7021 for level 2, you have to self-attest every year after your certification, right, in between your certification periods. And DFARS 7020, if DIBCAC decided to knock on your door and say, hey, we want to just check in and make sure you're actually good, could they revoke your CMMC cert if they have findings that say you're not meeting them?
Yeah.
I would assume so.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, if you get your CMMC status, CMMC certification, whether it's self-assessment, whether it's C3PAO assessment, or anything in between, and that for some reason under DFARS 7020, the DoD shows up through DIBCAC and they find out that things are not the way that were represented or claimed, then you absolutely can lose your CMMC status. So it isn't necessarily a one and done thing where you have a get out of jail free card for 3 years. Your diplomatic immunity license plates that you can just drive around.
DIBCAC can still sneak in on you.
All righty, let's see here.
Barrett just asked a fun question down there in chat.
Let's see.
Confirmation and invoice to the customer, which all contains the parts list, then also becomes CUI.
Oh, here, let's see. I think you split it into 2 parts.
Oh, okay. I was like, that's interesting.
Oh, it's 3 parts. All right, 3-part question here.
Okay.
Alrighty. Oddball question that I can't seem to find a straight answer on. If you receive a CUI document, in this case, a IT hardware parts list to produce a quote, does the related quote work product also become CUI since you took the data from the original document to generate the quote? And there's a follow-up question. If the previous question is to the affirmative, does the order confirmation and invoice to the customer, which all contain the parts list, then also become CUI 3?
So I know in the ITAR space, there are certain, part numbers and things of that nature that could potentially sneak in, I think is what I had heard. But most CUI, I've not seen many parts numbers or list or quotes that would fall in scope of being CUI unless you're actually attaching controlled technical information on top of that. Would you say the same thing, Jacob?
Yeah, it shouldn't be. It shouldn't be.
Yeah.
Your responses shouldn't be CUI in the sense that a lot of times when you look at the definition of FCI, a lot of the pricing information around what's required to conduct contractual interactions should not be CUI. If you receive something marked as CUI, what's interesting is you would be receiving the CUI on the bid. Let me see if I'm getting this sequence correct. You'd be receiving CUI in documents in order to respond to a solicitation, but your requirement to be CMC certified is a condition of contract award, which would mean that the government would be sending CUI to people that ostensibly are not yet required to have a CMC certification to handle that CUI. Now, that could either be a massive contradiction, or that could be leading to sort of the intuitive answer that it isn't CUI in the first place, and that they've probably overmarked it, right?
Yeah.
Does that make sense? So let's say you have a set of net new defense contractors that don't have CMMC yet. They're all showing up for the first time on their first bid, as this theoretical example. The government sends out information marked as CUI in order for them to create their bids on this solicitation. They have given the CUI to companies that aren't required to prove that they have implemented the controls to protect CUI until they take award of the thing that they are submitting a bid on. So the government would be sending CUI to people that it has no reason to believe have the ability to protect it. Does that make sense? Did I lose you? Let's see here.
It does. It makes sense to me. Yeah. He just put in chat, it is marked ITAR export control on the BOM, which I'm not, what's that acronym, Jacob?
I don't know. Barrett, what's BOM mean in your situation here? Wait for him to respond here in chat. But yeah, have you seen this question come up before, Daniel, in terms of like people responding to bids dealing with CUI?
I have.
It's bill of materials. That's right.
A bill of material. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, we've actually seen in SAM.gov and other, GSA releasing RFPs with CUI markings all over them that are publicly accessible, which is, should not be. It's typically an overmarking on the solicitation side. They should not be marking some of those things unless they already know, right, that they're sending them to qualified individuals, we'll call it. So it's probably just a case of overmarking in that regard. So Most of it is just, if your quotes and your part numbers, it is very rarely I've ever seen those in scope. And it's definitely not in scope if they're COTS products, consumer off-the-shelf products. But if they are ITAR export control as part of this, that's where I think ITAR has some additional identification requirements. And I'll look to find the specific verbiage from the Department of State and try and send that here in chat to you, Barrett. Or if you want to drop me a message in LinkedIn just directly, I'll find some extra information for you on the export control side.
Yeah,
but if it's just CUI, it's probably not gonna.
Yeah, and let us know, Barrett, if this is like a public solicitation or if this is like an individual interaction. You know, if this is a public solicitation, like on sam.gov or something like that, and they've got marked CUI documents on this public system, then there's a different problem at play here as to whether or not your solicitation and your bid in response to the solicitation is CUI. Does that make sense? So yeah, let us know. Let's see here. Oh man, okay. So Kenneth says, in the weeds, specific question about MFA. Recently told that persistent MFA is required even if accessing CUI from a protected network via controlled access policy. Let's see here. What's the reasoning behind this if only known devices are allowed on your local network anyway? MFA, persistent MFA is required if accessing CUI from a protected network via controlled access policy. Accessing CUI.
So I think I've got an idea for this one, Jacob. Do you mind if I pull out my whiteboard?
No, please.
These are my favorite things to do.
You're still sharing the screen here.
Yeah, let me share this one. Gotta do some.
You've already logged in. You've already logged in as an authorized user, authenticating with multi-factor, and now you're accessing CUI from a protected network. I'm trying to understand the sequence.
All right, so
here.
if you have,
I can't see your screen yet.
Oh, still coming up. Okay.
We get the whiteboard up here in a second for you, Ken. See, while we're waiting, Jonathan said, big fan of these sessions. Y'all should be uploading these to Spotify as well if you're not already. We'll get back to your question about TS facility clearances. I know the podcast gets uploaded to Spotify. I don't know if these are uploaded to Spotify. We'll ask producer Dustin if we're able to make that work here. But you definitely find the podcast on Spotify for sure. I don't know if these videos are, but we'll work on that. It's a good suggestion. And we'll get to your TS question here in just a second. All right, whiteboard time.
So Kenneth, I am not an artist, so massive disclaimer here to the audience. So I have a computer on a network, and that, let's say I have a application over here, you know, some kind of server line of business application. And in here, there's a multi-factor challenge, right? So, but what you have is you probably have, it's caching a local token. Once you log into multi-factor once, it's not constantly challenging you all the time. It's doing pass-through MFA authentication. And I think what you're saying is if this device is on the network and its certificate or whatever you're using, let's say you're using Radius on this, right, 802.1x, and you're already validating the device, and the device on the network is the one accessing the MFA line of business application over here, at what point do you get in this MFA loop? Like, how many MFA challenges do I need, and where is it enough? So the device MFA, good to go. It's on the local network, and it's accessing a resource on the local network as well, right? So you check that box. So your device is MFA. The device is the one with the user identity accessing the line of business application with the multi-factor challenge as well. We have not heard that people have required persistent MFA as long, it's almost like encrypting to encrypt, right? Like sending an encrypted packet through an encrypted tunnel. Double encryption doesn't really do anything extra to it, right? So as long as you're you can prove a multi-factor challenge to get to the application, device and user level, or user level in this case, then you should be good. And I think that that's probably the answer, or I think that's your question, I think. That's the hard part about LinkedIn comments is it's hard to get.
Yeah, if you want to send us a message, Kenneth, afterwards via LinkedIn, if you've got some more specific details about that question about your MFA applicability throughout the session, then we can maybe dive into it on the next session for sure. Your answer makes sense to me, Daniel, but it's tough with the. Yeah, okay, thanks. Yeah, he said he'll send us some more details, so we'll dig into that one a little bit more if we're off base on that answer. Alrighty, let's see. Rapid fire here, last one to go. Jonathan said, quick update for you. Dustin said, yes, we will get the back catalog of live sessions and future hotlines on both Spotify and other podcast platforms. So
good.
Sometime here in the new year, Dustin works pretty quick. We'll get those uploaded so you can check it out on Spotify too. He said, my question is regarding TS facility clearances. Our current networks follow CMMC level 1 or level 2, but we lease a TS facility that follows CMMC level 3. Would we inherit the facilities level 3? So, no. Yeah, I think this goes
their physical access controls of the facility, but you not automatically get grandfathered into their certification by using their facility.
Yeah. Now, if you're relying on them for whatever their protections are, physical level, then for sure. Depending on the nature of the lease, right? If it's just the physical facility itself, then it kind of stops there. Whereas if it's some sort of service provider that's managing services or doing things for you, or you're operating inside applications or things like that, then your SRM is going to be changed up in different ways for level 3. But you won't automatically be granted level 3 because you're living inside of a TS facility that would meet level 3. Let's see here. All right.
Sam Styles.
Oh, Sam question. Styles. Our
Samothy
old
Styles.
Here. All right. Bonus question here. Then we'll wrap up because we're right over an hour. Do you think the release of Microsoft Copilot in GCC is bad news for the DIB?
I don't think it's bad news for the DIB. I think it's good news from a discovery process. But here's the gotcha with Copilot. Copilot will index anything that user has access to. And what a lot of people realize when they launch any kind of AI tool and it starts crawling your network and your clouds and all of that is that the permission structure, the data tagging, the data labeling, marking has not been done properly. And you end up with a massive level of exposure of corporate IP to individuals or even financial records, et cetera, to people that should not have access to that information. So I think Copilot from a productivity suite is a fantastic bolt-on that Microsoft's added. However, I think it should be used very slowly in your organization after appropriate data governance has been done. Because if not, you're going to have CUI access for people that should not have CUI access, and not only just corporate stuff, right? So
just the data flow implications.
That's right. Use it very, very, very carefully. Sam, great having you. Happy for the comment. And I think your new company, AvePoint, actually has some tools that might be able to help with that. So
heck yeah.
If you guys have any issues or questions, reach out to old Sam Styles here.
Yeah, might also see some cool stuff from those guys at CS2 Reston. So make sure you use that registration code coming up, and look out for future agenda updates in the next couple weeks. But yeah, tale as old as time. Something like Copilot. I mean, insert new technological innovation here, and we adopt it before we update the corresponding governance, and then we create a bunch of technical debt that we have to spend a lot of time and money mopping up afterwards. So yeah, you can leverage them. Very powerful, very awesome, but there's no such thing as a free lunch. So just make sure that you guys are aware of the data flow implications of what happens when you fire up CMMC Skynet there. All righty. It's over our 1 hour mark. We got a bunch of questions. If we didn't get to your question, we'll queue them up for the next session, and we will go from there. It is Friday the 13th, so everybody watch your backs out there.
That's right. No ladders, no cats. I mean, there's like a whole little list.
No mirrors, no nothing, and we'll go from there. And then we'll see you guys next week. Thanks, everybody.
Awesome. Have a good one, guys.